Back in 2019, two brawls broke out at buffets. One was in Huntsville, Alabama, the other in Queens, New York. 48 hours apart from each other. But there was one common denominator. Does anyone know what that is?
Alcohol.
Not alcohol, although that's a good guess.
Crispy chicken.
Not the crispy chicken. Crab legs. In both incidents, crab legs started a brawl in these two buffets. And actually there is a history of brawls in buffets being caused by crab legs. It happened in 2013 in Sarasota. It happened in 2016 in Manchester, Connecticut. And the article I was reading was kind of funny. It described, how this is, and it says, here's what they say. Combine a luxury food with the intensity of a buffet experience, and you have a recipe for flaring tempers. I've never had have you ever had an intense buffet experience? I haven't. I don't know what that's talking about. But apparently, when you get a group of people competing for food, tempers flare. And we know that many times people get so upset over silly, ridiculous things. And they fight over things that really aren't important. And as I was looking at this, I was thinking about conflict. I was thinking about anger and people getting upset. And it's one thing when you are upset or fighting with someone who you don't know. I mean, that's the world we live in today. You don't know these. There's road rage. There's all these things. When you're angry at people you don't know. But when it's someone you do know, when it's someone you love, when it's someone in your family, that conflict hurts. And the wounds of those types of conflicts run deep. We have been looking at Genesis, and we've been looking at how God formed and brought order to his creation. We have seen how God has dealt with mankind's sin and rebellion. We have seen God speak and interact with his people. We saw how God entered into a covenant relationship with Abraham, and God chose Abraham to be a blessing to the entire earth. And through the generations that come after Abraham, we will see over and over that there are threats to the covenant promises. With Abraham, the main threat was he couldn't have kids. How could God bless Abraham's descendants if he couldn't have kids? And we saw how God overcame that conflict, overcame that obstacle, and was faithful to his promise. Last week we looked at Isaac. And the struggle for Isaac was finding a wife. Finding a wife that wasn't an idolater, that wasn't a pagan, that wouldn't lead him down a path that would take him away from God. And we saw how God overcame that conflict, that obstacle, and was faithful to his promise. Today we're going to see a new conflict. Not one that is physical, not an issue with someone being barren, not being able to have kids, but a conflict, an obstacle that comes from family that can't get along together. So let's look at Genesis chapter 25, starting in verse 19. And we'll look at two brothers, Jacob and Esau, that both threaten the covenant because of the way they act. Look at verse 19. These are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham fathered Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean of Padan Aram, the sister of Laban the Aramean, to be his wife. And Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren. And the Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. What's really interesting about this is we see Isaac is facing the same situation that his father did. Isaac finds himself in the same situation where Abraham and Sarah couldn't have kids. And I think what we see here is that Isaac had learned from his parents. Isaac had learned from his father that God was able to overcome the situation that they were facing. And we see Isaac doing the right thing, taking his problems to God, going to the Lord, seeking help from God. And it tells us that God answered his prayer and Rebekah conceived. We see that through the generations there's always struggles, but there's also learning, there's also growth, there's also progress. And it's not complete. But Isaac had learned from his father to trust God, that God could that God could allow his wife to have a child. And God answered that prayer. But we're going to see the struggle within this family is different than the previous generation. Look at verse 22. The children struggled together within her. And she said, if it is thus, why is this happening to me? So she went to inquire of the Lord. Now the situation is she's having twins, and Rebekah can tell that something's wrong. Rebekah can tell that even though these twin brothers, she doesn't know that they're sons yet, but these twins that are inside her, that they are fighting even in the womb. It's kind of a picture of what's to come. Rebekah, from a very early time, was able to tell there's something that's just not quite right. Now, we don't know what this is. I think it was from God. I think God was giving her some insight into what was really going on. But even from the womb, it describes these two brothers as fighting against each other. And Rebekah doesn't understand. She says, why is this happening? Well, and I think this is a great question, by the way, because I know I've come to the Lord many times with this question, why? Why is this happening? Lord, why do I have to experience this trial? Why aren't things in my life working out the way I think they should? Why aren't you answering my prayers? Why are things difficult? Why do I face trials? And Rebekah comes with this question, why is this happening to me? I think she perceives that something is wrong, but she doesn't understand why God would allow something to be wrong in her life. God has promised to bless. God has given this blessing and this covenant to her family, and yet something is off. Something is wrong. And she doesn't understand. So let's look at the Lord's response. It says in 23, the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other. The older shall serve the younger. What God reveals to Rebekah is really remarkable. And I think it sheds light on what is going to happen from this point on in the rest of the book of Genesis. There's 2 children in her womb. And these 2 children represent 2 different people groups, 2 different nations. I mean, could you imagine to hear, before your children are even born, that your children are going to be against each other? They're going to be divided. They are not going to be united as one throughout their entire lives, and even after their lives, their ancestors will be against each other. I mean, when we think of our kids, we all want our kids to get along when they grow up, right? I mean, I know that I have prayed for my kids that they would get along, that there would be peace in our house. And could you imagine a mother finding out that her kids will not have peace? Her kids will not be united. They will be against each other their whole lives. Not only that, we see something very significant, I think. We are seeing the beginning of the realization that not all descendants of Abraham are part of the covenant. We see in these two children, one receives the covenant promises, but the other does not. One receives the blessings that were promised to Abraham. The other is left out of the covenant. And what this tells us is the younger will be the one who receives the covenant promises. Now, in that ancient mindset, things worked very differently than they do today. If you were the oldest child, you received special benefits. You received a double portion of the inheritance. You were promised to be the leader of your family once your father passed away. Those things always went to the oldest child. And what God is doing here is taking those cultural beliefs, those cultural norms, and He's shattering them. God is showing His people that He will not follow what people believe to be the cultural norms for the day. God doesn't abide by our understanding. He does what He wants to do. And if He chooses the younger, then the younger will be blessed. And I just can imagine what was going through Rebecca's mind when God tells her this. God is warning her of conflict that is coming. He's warning her that He is going to change their mindset and the cultural paradigm that they live in and turn it all upside down, because God doesn't abide by man's cultural norms. And we can just imagine the confusion and the struggle that she was experiencing. So let's look at verse 24. When her days to give birth were completed, behold, there were twins in her womb. The first came out red, all his body like a hairy cloak. So they called his name Esau. Afterwards, his brother came out, with his hand holding Esau's heel. So his name was called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. Just as there was conflict in the womb, we see that even at their birth, there is conflict. It is almost as if they are fighting to be first out of their mother's womb. It's kind of a funny picture to think about, right? Two babies inside their mother, struggling to be the first one out, struggling to be the firstborn. It is like there is this competition, this struggle between the two to be the firstborn. And even though Esau is born first, Jacob comes out grabbing onto the heel of his brother. Now, we're not there yet, but in a few weeks we're going to see that Jacob is going to not grab onto the heel of his brother, but he's going to grab onto someone else to receive the blessings that God has given to him. Jacob and Esau were in conflict from their birth. Were in competition from their birth. They were divided in almost every way you could think. They were completely different. We're going to see that in verse 27 through 28. It says, when the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man, dwelling in tents. They're complete opposites. They have different, they value different things. They have different hobbies, different pursuits. Esau loves to go hunt, while Jacob likes to stay at home in the tent. Esau is kind of pictured as strong, as a man who is familiar with the outdoors. And Jacob is different. And even more important, look at verse 28. Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his gain, but Rebekah loved Jacob. In this story, we see a family divided against itself. We see a family that is divided. Not only are Jacob and Esau in constant conflict for the blessing and the rights of the firstborn, but Isaac and Rebekah have taken sides. What we are seeing here is a family that is dysfunctional, a family where where favorites are chosen, and as a result there is conflict that comes as a result of that. We see that the struggle that the covenant is facing now is the family is divided against itself. And how is God going to fulfill his promise when his people are divided against each other? Now, there is so much that we're going to see about the relationship between Jacob and Esau throughout the course of Genesis. But what we see in these introductory verses is a family divided. It's foreshadowing danger and conflict. And what we know, as we've all experienced this, is that conflict costs something. That when there is conflict between people, there is always a cost. What we're going to see in the life of this family is that we're going to see hurt. We're going to see pain. We're going to see the lengths at which these people will go to hurt each other. And I think as I look at this, I think this is very relatable to many of us. And I think it's very important for us to see that the families that God chose were not perfect families. They were families that struggled. They were families that were sinful. They were families that over and over again made the wrong choices. But what we also see is that even though in our humanity we are fallen and sinful, that God in his sovereignty and his power is faithful to his covenant. And what we're going to see is how God takes the brokenness of this family and redeems it. We're going to see how God takes this conflict between two brothers and through, I think, miraculous ways reconciles it. But as a result of their sinfulness, they have to go down a path that is painful, that is long, not because that's what God chose for them, but because their sin led them to a path that was painful. And we will learn that God is able to redeem and bring reconciliation to the brokenness of this family. Now there's one other picture, one other glimpse I want to give into the family before this morning as we look at this situation. We already know that Jacob and Esau don't like each other, right? They're divided. They both want something. They both want to be the first. They both want to be the most important. And we're going to see that they are both very flawed people. That they are both flawed as they go about trying to get God's blessing. Look at verse 29. Time has passed. We don't know how old they are. But in verse 29 it says, once when Jacob was cooking stew, Esau came in from the field and was exhausted. So they're both doing their thing. Jacob is staying in the tent. Esau is out hunting. This seems to be a normal situation. And it says in verse 30, and Esau said to Jacob, Let me eat some of that red stew, for I am exhausted. Therefore his name was called Edom. Edom in Hebrew means red. And we see red coming up a few times in the description of Esau. When he was born, he was red, right? He came out red. When he saw the red stew, all of these associations with red are now forevermore associated with Esau. He sees this stew. He's hungry. He's exhausted. If you were a good brother, what would you do? If you were a good brother and your brother came in exhausted and hungry, what would a normal brother do? Give him some stew, right? Okay, so we're going to see, like I mentioned, both of these brothers are very, very flawed, very sinful. Because Jacob doesn't respond like a good brother. Jacob shows who he is. We see throughout Jacob's life, he's a manipulator. He's a schemer. He will take advantage of you for his own personal gain. So look at what Jacob says. Verse 31. Jacob said, "Sell me your birthright now." So instead of looking at his brother, hungry, needing food, his response is, "I'll give you food if you sell me the birthright." Now, Jacob, I think, was a smart guy. He was a schemer, he was crafty, but he was smart. He knew his brother. He knew the weaknesses of his brother. He knew that if his brother was exhausted and wanted food, he would do just about anything to get it. And so when the opportune time came, he said, "Give me the birthright." Now, this goes back to that conflict and division between these two. Jacob was at Esau's heel, trying to supplant Esau, trying to take Esau's place. He wanted the birthright. Now, I've already mentioned this a little bit. The birthright was the firstborn received a double portion of the inheritance. He received more than every other person. And he was given authority in the family. That's what Jacob wanted. Jacob wanted more things. He wanted more money, more possessions. He wanted to be in charge. And he refuses to help his brother until his brother gives him the birthright. We have to understand the birthright was a valuable thing, an important thing. In those days especially, the birthright was something that was very, very precious. And Jacob wants to take it. I think in a way that is conniving and manipulative. But look at Esau. Esau said, "I am about to die. Of what use is the birthright to me?" Now, we've talked about Jacob a little bit. Jacob is flawed. He is crafty, scheming, conniving, manipulative. But look at Esau. He's a little dramatic, right? He's going to die. We've all been in those situations where we see people who are over dramatized. He wasn't going to die. But we see that he is impulsive. We see that he's hasty. He's irresponsible. And what we're going to see is he shows contempt for something that's precious. He had the right. He had the birthright. And he treats it as if it's no big deal. He treats it as if it is something that can be sold for stew. He doesn't care about something that should be such a huge thing in his life. The blessings of the birthright, the promises of God that came with it. And he treats it as if it's nothing, that it can be sold. He is willing to sell the birthright and the blessings that come from God as a result of that birthright for some food. And verse 33 says, Jacob said, "Swear to me now." So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. I've already mentioned these two brothers are both very deeply flawed and sinful. Neither one of them really deserve anything from God. Esau, it says here, despised what God had so graciously promised to his family. And I think we learned some very important things. Esau is like a lot of people in many regards who treat the blessing of God with contempt. Who treat the blessings of God as if they are common and ordinary and no big deal. And maybe you've known people like that over the time of your life. As a pastor, I've certainly seen people like that who treat the blessings of not this covenant with Abraham, but the blessings of the new covenant with contempt. The blessings of forgiveness and reconciliation, the blessings of justification, and all of the things that come with being a child of God. They treat it as if it doesn't matter. They treat it as if it's no big deal. I think Paul talks about people who continue to sin so that grace may increase. People who take what God has given and then just go live however they choose. Ignore the blessings that come with salvation and decide, I'm going to live my life however I want, and I'm going to ignore God, I'm going to disobey God, I'm going to do what I want. We see that in Esau despising the blessings of God. We have to be very careful. We are not like Esau and have contempt for God's blessings. I think it is very clear as we look at this passage that Esau is in error and he is sinful in his approach to God. But the truth of the matter is, so is Jacob. Esau's fault was he despised God's blessings. Whereas Jacob, his fault is he thinks he can receive God's blessings through manipulation. He thinks that he is smart enough to trick and fool everyone to receive God's blessings. And he's willing to do whatever it takes. He is not innocent in this incident. He is guilty too. He's trying to manipulate the things that God has given freely to his people. You know, as I look at this story, there have been a few times in my life I've been in situations where supplies are short. Like in Florida, we were there for a hurricane. And during a hurricane, you know, you go to the grocery store and you can't find anything. And there's lines at the gas stations because everyone's trying to get gas. And here just about a year ago, the derecho was the same thing. And in those situations, some people take advantage and price gouge. Right? And we know that that's against the law, but it happens. Prices go up because everybody is trying to get something at once. And when you look at people like that, what do you think when someone is trying to price gouge you? I mean, you know that they're trying to take advantage of you. And Jacob was taking advantage of his brother, thinking that he could get the blessings of God through manipulation. Sometimes as Christians, we try to manipulate God to give us the things we want. Sometimes we think if we just do something a certain way, we can get God to bless us. Sometimes we think that if we do good things, that will somehow earn God's favor in our lives. Somehow we think if we pray enough, or we read the Bible enough, or we serve enough, that God will bless us. And we fall in that danger of thinking that we can manipulate God to give us the things we want. As we look at this story, we see two brothers. One of them is going to receive the blessing, but the truth is, neither one of them deserve it. And what we learn in this passage, I think, is really important. The truth is, neither one deserved. But God's covenant, God's blessings, are not based on whether we deserve it or not. Because the truth is, no one deserves the blessings of the covenant. No one deserves it. The truth is, because of our sin, none of us deserve fellowship and a relationship with God. We learn through this passage, the covenant is not based on who deserves God's blessing. We're also going to learn, not necessarily from this passage, but the rest of the story, how God is able to take flawed, broken people and transform them and change them into people of faith. How God can take Jacob, because the narrative from this point on focuses on Jacob. How God takes this manipulative, sinful man and transforms him into a man of faith. How God takes all of the brokenness that he leaves in his wake, because every relationship in his life seems to be left in destruction when he leaves. How God is able to take that destruction and weave it into something beautiful. And that's what God can do in our lives too. God is able to fix what's broken. God is able to heal. God is able to bring reconciliation to relationships that have been torn apart. But Jacob had to learn to trust. Jacob had to learn to submit. And the rest of the next few weeks, we're going to see how Jacob struggles, how Jacob fights, but finally how Jacob trusts in God. I've already mentioned this story falls under the old covenant, but we now live under the new covenant of Jesus. And there's some similarities. Just like Jacob and Esau didn't deserve the covenant, neither do we. But through Jesus Christ and what he did on the cross, we are given an offer of salvation based on what he has done. Jesus died on the cross for our sins, and Scripture tells us that if we believe in our hearts, and if we confess with our mouths and believe in our hearts, we will be saved. It tells us that there is hope of salvation and redemption through Jesus. And that salvation is an eternal salvation. John 3:16 says that God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him shall have everlasting life. But all that redemption also means that there is sanctification here on the earth as well. and that there is hope for healing on this earth as well. Healing of relationships, healing from the destruction of our sinful choices. There's hope. And I just want to encourage you as we look at this story. I hope you're encouraged to see that God uses broken, flawed people. I can relate to that because I'm broken and flawed. I know that I fail so much. And I'm just so encouraged that God doesn't give up on his people because they fail. God doesn't give up on his people because they're selfish. Because they treat each other poorly. The covenant endures. And that was true with Jacob and Esau. And that's true today too. God's promises endure in your life. Even when you fail. Even when you sin. Even when you hurt other people. God is faithful. Let's pray. Lord, I thank you so much for your goodness and faithfulness. I thank you that we see all throughout history you work in broken and fallen people. How you love broken and fallen people. How you redeem broken and fallen people. And I pray that you would help us, like Jacob, eventually we learn to trust. And I pray that you will teach us to trust your faithfulness and goodness. I pray that we won't be like Jacob and we have to experience pain and suffering to get to that point where we give in, where we submit. I pray that we will learn to trust as we see you at work in our lives. And I just thank you for all the blessings you give us. I pray this in your name.